here on NFL Fantasy Live. It's time for the starts and sits from Michael F. Florio. Go to NFL.com/startsits for the full list, but we get the full treatment with the man himself here on our show, starting with the quarterbacks. What are we doing this week start-wise?
Look, you were talking about them last segment. I agree fully. I think you start George Pickens this week, and I think you start Russell Wilson because he's playing the Ravens, and it is a fantastic matchup. But Russ himself have been playing good ball since he's taken over, averaging just under 19 fantasy points per game. But the matchup, the Ravens have allowed the most passing yards and touchdowns this season, the second most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks since week 5. All but one quarterback who has faced them has scored over 20 fantasy points. The one that didn't had 18. So the floor is very high. The ceiling is very high because the Ravens are the one team that maybe could get Russ to actually have to throw a whole bunch more than usual. And then I think you want to start Bo Nix this week. He did not have a great fantasy game last week, but the way he handled the Chiefs defense impressed me so much. It was huge to see. And now, in his last 6 games, he has averaged 20 fantasy points per game. Only one time has he had fewer than 15, so he brings a safe floor, and we clearly see that there's upside there. The Falcons, they have allowed the 3rd most passing yards and touchdowns to quarterbacks since week 6, and the 3rd most rushing yards this season, so we could see Nix get going with his legs again, and that is the best version of Nix for fantasy.
Yeah, one of the better scramblers in the NFL to start this season, even considering some of the other guys that we have, including Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Jaden Daniels, Bo Nix scrambling at a high rate. Let's go over to benching someone. Mike, who are you putting down there?
It pains me to say, but Geno Smith has a really tough matchup this week against the 49ers, who are one of the 3 teams that he has scored fewer than 15 fantasy points against this year. And in 4 regular season games against them, Geno has averaged 232 passing yards per game with just 2 touchdowns and 4 interceptions. And he has never beaten them, including in the playoffs. San Fran, they've allowed one top 15 quarterback in their last 7 games and in bottom 10 in fantasy points and passing yards allowed to quarterbacks. So I especially with some more of the fringy quarterbacks having good matchups, I think you could get away from Geno Smith for someone like Herbert or Nix or Drake May. Those are options I would play over him this week.
Yeah, it's always option and matchup dependent. Take the starts and sits and apply the extra context and make your decision. Let's leave the quarterbacks and go to some running backs. Mike, who's starting?
Yeah, when Marcus was sitting over here, he didn't like one of my running backs, but I'm going to start with James Cook here. The production as of late has dipped for James Cook, and he gets the toughest matchup for a running back. The Chiefs have allowed the fewest rushing yards and touchdowns to running backs, so I know a lot of you out there might be like, can I get away from James Cook this week? I still don't think you can. In the last 2 games against the Chiefs, he's averaged 17 opportunities and topped 80 yards in both, and he has 5 targets in each of those games. And with the Bills' pass catchers being so banged up, I think he is going to be heavily used as a receiver this week. And then Chase Brown. I know Marcus doesn't love him, but I do think this is a week where you can continue to start Chase Brown. He has played over 80% of the snaps in 2 straight and has averaged 20 opportunities in his last 5 games. Since week 5, he is giving you over 17 fantasy points per game. And the Chargers have been tough against running backs this year, but they have allowed explosive runs at the highest rate in the NFL since week 6. So I think the explosive Chase Brown could get a big run or 2 there. And I would continue to start him right now in fantasy.
All right, starts in disagreement. Although Marcus said it's still a start, just a risky one. Albeit,
friends can disagree.
Well, yeah, still disagrees. We're all good friends here. Who are we sitting though?
I would sit Najee Harris this week because not only did we see Jaylen Warren get more involved last week, especially in the passing game, that is huge this week because the Ravens are elite against the run. Second fewest rushing yards allowed, just 3.2 yards per carry, and they've allowed explosive runs at by far the lowest rate in the NFL. Their weakness, though, is against running backs in the passing game, and if that work is going to Jaylen Warren, he could actually outproduce Najee Harris for fantasy this week. Plus, on top of it all, Najee tweaked his ankle at the end of last week, so that is just another thing you might have to worry about in this game.
Yeah, almost a surprise to see Najee come back into the game. We'll see how things go for him against the Ravens, but let's get a sleeper quarterback with Marcus Grant.
Let's do that indeed as we look to the Week 11 sleepers. I got for you a quarterback and a couple of running backs you might want to keep on your radar. Let's start in Detroit with Jared Goff. Now, a recent internet disinformation campaign might lead you to believe that throwing interceptions only makes Jared Goff stronger. That is not true. What is true, though, is that Goff and the Lions have a fantastic matchup this week against the Jacksonville Jaguars. The Jaguars continue to be one of the best matchups for quarterbacks that you have all season long. And even though Goff has been sort of meh for good stretches of the season, this feels like an opportunity for him to really get back on track, really put together one of those good fantasy games. And as Mike mentioned, if you have some fringe quarterbacks you're not sure about, Goff's a nice guy to plug into your lineup. Now over to the running back position where we've got Nick Chubb. And Nick Chubb has really been a nice story this year, but the fantasy production hasn't quite been there for him. This week, though, things could really turn around. New Orleans has the 28th ranked run defense, running backs averaging more than 5 yards per carry against the Saints. They've also allowed the second most rushing touchdowns to the position. The volume for Chubb hasn't been bad. He's getting about 15 touches per game. It hasn't really translated into fantasy production. That could change for him this week. And on a deep sleeper at running back, maybe it's time to get on the bus. Gus Edwards is back, and in his return, had 10 carries for 55 yards, played just 14 snaps. Now, I expect that snap number to go up a little bit this week against Cincinnati's 21st ranked run defense, opposing running games averaging 4 yards per carry against Cincinnati. Look, we're still going to see plenty of J.K. Dobbins in this one, but Gus Edwards came out, looks very, very good. Looks like the two-headed monster has been resurrected in Jim Harbaugh's offense.
Let's get back out to that board and start moving people around with sticks as it's more starts and sits with Michael F. Florio. We did the quarterbacks and the running backs. Now it's time for some wide receivers and tight ends. We'll start with the faster pass catchers. Who we starting?
Sometimes all you need is an opportunity, right? And Jauan Jennings is the face of that this season because he has played 2 games, one without Debo, one without Brandon Ayuk, and in each of those, he has gone absolutely off. Last week was the game without Brandon Ayuk. He led the 49ers receivers in snaps, targets, catches, and receiving yards. The Seahawks are a fantastic matchup as well. They have allowed the second most fantasy points per game to wide receivers in the last month, 7 top 12 wide receivers in the last 6 games. I agree with what Marcus was saying earlier. I think Brock Purdy goes off this week, and I think Jauan Jennings is a big winner of that happening.
All right, a big winner for Jauan Jennings, at least in the starts and sits. Who's the loser this week?
I have a lot of big name sits at wide receiver, and the biggest, the guy who is battling the sun this week, C.D. Lamb. I know it's a night game. That is not why I'm saying to sit him, though. He had 21 yards last week. That is his fewest in a game since 2021. Cowboys quarterbacks last week combined on 29 pass attempts threw for 66 yards and 1 interception, no touchdowns. This feels a lot like Tyreek Hill without Tua, where your situation kind of dictates if you're able to get away or not. But if you can get away, I am fine doing so this week. And then I would also sit DJ Moore. We have gotten to this point with the Bears offense. I know they just fired Shane Waldron, but until we see different, I am handling this Bears offense as if it is exactly what it appears, broken. He has averaged 6 fantasy points per game in the last 4 games, topped 40 yards once in his last 6, and now he gets the Packers, who've allowed the fewest yards to wide receivers since week 6 and the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game in the last month. DeAndre Swift, to me, is the only Bear that I feel confident starting.
Yeah, you go with a couple of struggling offenses there in the sits, and it makes perfect sense, especially considering the situations. As we've already seen changes in one spot, waiting on potentially some in some others. Let's go to the tight ends. Who's the start there?
Look, it took 2 weeks. I think TJ Hawkinson is firmly back to being a must-start tight end. He tied for the team lead last week with 9 targets, led the Vikings with 8 catches for 72 yards, and finished as a top 5 fantasy tight end. Not only was that just his 2nd game back, he still didn't even play half of the snaps in it. So as he gets healthier and starts seeing the field more and more, he will get consistent usage. Again, just back to being a weekly must-start tight end. But I can't say the same for a couple of big names.
Oh, we got some big name spots. Who's going on the bench?
I'm attacking, I guess you could say, struggling offenses this week with start and sit, and that includes the Jaguars. So I would try to get away from Evan Ingram, who had 10 fantasy points on 10 targets last week. I think there's an argument to be made that his ceiling with Mac Jones is close to around what the floor was with Trevor Lawrence. Add on top of it that Ingram has fewer than 50 yards in 5 of 6 games and just 1 touchdown this season. And the Lions, they've been elite against tight ends, 5th fewest yards, lowest passer rating when targeted, and no touchdowns allowed to the position since week 6. And then I'm sticking on avoiding all of my Cowboys right now, which if I'm telling you to sit CeeDee Lamb, I'm clearly going to say sit Jake Ferguson as well. The good news for Ferguson is he led the Cowboys in yards last week. The bad news is he had 24 yards, and the quarterback play was rough. And now he gets the Texans, which are the toughest matchup for a tight end. They've allowed the fewest yards, lowest passer rating when targeted, and completion percentage to tight ends this season. Just plenty of reasons to stay away from Jake Ferguson this week.
Yeah, a theme here in the sits is we get teams with backup quarterbacks who are on struggling offenses. So if you rightfully get those guys on the bench, you might need the help of a sleeper. Let's get some from Marcus Grant.
Let's do that indeed. Let's talk some pass-catching sleepers here in Week 11. We will start in Pittsburgh with Mike Williams. And look, Florio said earlier in the show that he's not sure that he would start Mike Williams. But you know what? I'm crazy. I'll sell you this monitor for $10. Mostly because it's not mine. Here's the thing. Mike Williams, I know he only played 9 snaps last week, but 1 catch, one target, 1 catch, 1 touchdown. That's called high efficiency. I do think we're going to see him work in a little bit more. He's a good downfield threat with a quarterback who throws a good deep ball. We have talked repeatedly this season about the Ravens being a very wide receiver and quarterback-friendly matchup. So understand, yes, this is a boomer bust risk-reward sort of setup here, but Mike Williams does have the ability and the quarterback to pay it off for you. Now over to tight ends. If you were watching our show earlier in the week, in fact, on Tuesday, you heard Adam Rank mention Will Dissly as El Diablo on the waiver wire hot sauce. And I think this is a week you can sort of sprinkle that on your fantasy roster. Second on the team in targets this year, 5 or more targets in 4 of his last 5 games, 8 or more fantasy points in 3 of the last 4. I know you look at it, you're like 8 points. If you're streaming a tight end, that's not a bad output for you going against the Bengals, who have been the 4th best matchup for tight ends this season. And you want a deep sleeper. All right, this is a little bit nuts. I told you I was crazy. We're doing this. Marquez Valdes-Scantling, last week, 3 catches for over 100 yards and 2 tutties. At first, I'm like, am I chasing the points? And then I looked at the active receivers left on the Saints roster. It's Mason Tipton. It's Cedric Wilson. It's Jermaine Jackson. No, not that one, but Chris Olave. I want you back. They're going against the Cleveland Browns, the 5th highest fantasy points allowed to wide receivers this year, 6th most touchdowns allowed to wide receivers this year. Derek Carr's got to throw the ball to somebody that's not named Alvin Kamara. It could be MVS. It's that guy you slide into your flex spot. I can't believe I just did that.